Hello and welcome back to the What is That Weapon series, where we cover different weapons and discuss their power levels. In today's video, we will be reviewing a weapon that's got a lot of power in the PvP environment specifically. I'm talking about the TRUENO needle launcher. I'm not sure if it's TRUENO or TRUENO. I like to call it TRUENO, so that's what I'm going to go with. As a quick overview, the TRUENO is a back-mounted railgun that actually fires two kinetic needles at a target, and these needles do a ton of stagger buildup. And for whatever reason, these needles have homing properties, which really lets them home in on whatever target you're locked into. And in combination of that and their high velocities, it's really kind of hard to dodge these types of weapons. These weapons are unlocked as a part of the new Game Plus Plus playthrough, where it's unlocked after, I believe, the second arena battle in that playthrough. Now let's look at the strengths and the weaknesses of this weapon type. Starting with the strengths of the TRUENO, as I mentioned earlier, it has an insanely high stagger amount since it's a kinetic weapon. A single TRUENO volley does about 50% of a stagger bar by itself. As a result, this makes it a very strong option in stagger-based builds to create damage of stagger windows. The second strength that I mentioned is that this weapon has a homing property, which makes it pretty easy to land, even if they dodge out of the way like that. Because of these two properties, it makes dodging the TRUENO extremely difficult, especially if you're using a booster that has a shorter jet duration. As for the weakness of the TRUENO, the first problem is, of course, its long lock-on time. As you can see here, these have about a 4-second lock-on time. You can see the bar is very slowly filling. This makes it so that you really have to wait between every single shot in order to get that lock-on effect. However, I would say that because of the very high projectile speed of the TRUENO, it's not necessary to actually have the lock-on. It's still worthwhile to pressure enemies without the actual lock-on itself. You can still land a few shots here and there just because of the sheer volume or velocity of those projectiles. This may not be a massive issue, but another weakness of the TRUENO is the fact that it can actually be outranged and it'll actually cause ricochet. So that's going to mean that you'll have very minimal stagger buildup and damage at that point. It looks like the effective range is about 300 and about 70 or 380 meters. So it still has a very healthy range, but it is still something to consider with this weapon. Basically, it might struggle a little bit with missile boats that are just permanently flying way up in the air and you're not really having any way to get up to them. The final weakness I want to bring up with this weapon is the damage. The TRUENO's damage is pretty mediocre when it's just landed raw. It's only doing about 700 damage per volley. So with its slow lock-on speed and reload time, it's not going to do a ton of damage. However, the TRUENO does have a very high direct hit adjustment. So if you happen to stagger an enemy, you can just fire off TRUENOs at that point, like point blank, and it'll do a ton of damage. So you can see as I stagger this enemy, the TRUENO are going to do a decent chunk of damage at that point. So they're doing about 2,000 damage when an enemy is staggered versus just 700 when you're hitting a non-staggered enemy. The problem with all of that is you're basically using the TRUENO just for the majority of the time for the stagger buildup. You're not really using it for the damage. It does do decent chip damage from a distance, so you can always use it to chip out enemies. But overall, the damage is just pretty mediocre, which is one of the weaknesses, I would say. Now let's talk about some of the build synergies out there for the TRUENO. Because of that slight range limitation of the weapon, I think it's best used in medium to close range builds. My preference is to use these types of weapons in a medium range thanks to the projectile tracking and the velocity. And when playing them at a medium range, you want to be using these weapons as a way to initiate stagger windows and then use a big payoff weapon, such as the charged laser rifle. So a build I would consider running is double TRUENO to create stagger windows and capitalize on that window with the KSRV. Another build option I think that can run this is a close range hit and run style build. You can use the TRUENO as a mid-range initiation tool to start an engagement with a decent chunk of stagger built up, jump in and land a stagger, getting your damage in, and then backing off until your TRUENO locks on again. This type of build and playstyle has been pretty effective in a flamethrower build and is one of my most fun builds to play. In this final section, I want to talk about the playstyle for the TRUENO, and like I said, I think this works well in a hit and run or mid-range burst build. You'll want to use the TRUENO as a primary source for stagger generation and then capitalize on the stagger windows it creates. There are a lot of weapons that can be used in combination with the TRUENO, which allows it to be fairly easily slotted into most builds. But that's going to wrap up this weapon showcase. Let me know what type of build you guys are using with the TRUENO and how effective it's been for you. With how impactful the Stagger system is in Armored Core 6, the TRUENO feels like a very versatile weapon. That's going to be it from me though. This was GooberTroy, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.